My name is Satyaki Brockschmidt. I'm the author of the Harmonium Handbook, and in this video I'm going to show you various basics about how to play this wonderful instrument. The harmonium is actually one of the easiest instruments to learn how to play. The reason for this is that you don't need a very close coordination between the actions of your two hands. One hand is pumping the bellows while the other hand is playing the melody or the song on the keyboard. But these don't need to be as closely matched as, say, with a guitar, where you have to hold the strings in a particular way. At the moment, you're also plucking or strumming with the other hand. On a wind instrument, even further, you have to coordinate both of your hands with whatever knobs you're playing or holes on a flute, for example, with also your breathing. The harmonium doesn't require that because, again, the two actions are rather uncoupled from the other. And let me demonstrate that. To prove this point, open at least one air stop on the harmonium. Usually I have the first and third open to get both the bass and the male reeds. And without holding any keys down, just pump the bellows a couple of times until you feel them stiffen. That stiffness indicates that there's air inside the instrument, building up inside the internal bellows, and those are typically hidden from view. Now, after that pumping, you let go of the bellows and then hold down some keys. And you could play different notes in succession as well, but you notice that the air, I'm not doing any kind of pumping, and the air pressure that's in the internal bellows is being bled out and sustaining the sound all by itself. Let me demonstrate that again. You can hear that the air is bleeding out and thus the volume is decreasing. But the whole point here is that you can see how pumping and playing the keys aren't closely interlinked as with other instruments. Your pumping hand really only needs to maintain the internal air pressure, and whereas your keyboarding hand just needs to play the notes of the melody. Thus, if you can pluck out a melody with one hand that you're playing with and just slowly open and close your other hand on the bellows, you can really learn how to play the harmonium without that strong level of coordination. You can really hold the harmonium any way that's comfortable that allows you easy access to the bellows and a free-flowing arm and hand across the keyboard. I have it sitting on a small table in front of a chair. I could also have it sitting in front of me if I'm sitting on the floor. Some people like to have the harmonium up on one leg, playing it this way, or even have their arm and using the bellows on the other side. You can also, if you want to switch hands, you can play it that way as well. It doesn't really matter, as long as it's comfortable for you and, again, you get that unobstructed use of the bellows. With your posture, what's really important is that the whole of your playing arm, and I'm going to demonstrate with my right arm because I'm right-handed, that whole arm is relaxed from the shoulder all the way down to the wrist. Look at the fluidity of that. And the reason for this is that the keyboard is straight, but your arm and your hands, everything has rotational circular motion, right? And so if you're trying to go up and down the keyboard, you have to do a motion like this. If you try that, you can see that to move my hand in a straight line, I need to use the rotation of my wrist, my elbow, and my shoulder all together. So when you're on the keyboard, you can see that that kind of fluidity of motion allows you to go up and down the keyboard any way you'd like. By contrast, if you hold your arm close to yourself and you stiffen your shoulder and you try to play, it gets really, really awkward, and it's very stiff. You want to have everything relaxed because the only tension you really need is a little bit in the fingers to depress the keys, which don't take very much force. The other reason a relaxed wrist is also important is that if you look at your fingers, you'll notice that the tips of your fingers really make a circle, and yet the keys are in a line. If you see how you can move your wrist and your arm to really get the straightness of the keyboard lined up with the fingers as you're rotating. So being able to move that elbow in and out and allowing your wrist to go up and down, allowing your wrist to go side to side is really important. The other thing too is notice that the wrist is fairly straight. You don't want to be crouched like this playing down on the keyboard. You want to have that elbow up and get a straight line between your fingers and the rest of your forearm so that you can slide up and down the keyboard very gently and naturally. Pumping the external bellows is one of the key actions, of course, for playing the harmonium. What you need to understand about this instrument is there's a second bellows inside the case that has springs on it so that you inflate it with this external bellows. Air pressure builds on the inside, and then that air pressure can bleed out when you're playing notes. So it's very much like inhaling when you're singing or speaking. You take a short breath and then you exhale over a long period of time, and that's what you'll see with the bellows here. Let me try to demonstrate that. Do you see how my motion of the bellows is gently in and then quickly out, gently in, quickly out, gently in, quickly out. On most harmoniums, again, the bellows have a spring that moves them open automatically like this one. You can see if I pull it in, I let it go, the spring pops it back out again. So for the inhalation, again, I just need to open my hand and let the bellows fall into those so I can sustain a sound. So the key point here is not to impede the opening of the bellows with your hand. You want to open your hand quickly and let the bellows fall into them, and as soon as they're mostly expanded, don't wait at all, just go ahead and start to clench your fingers and bring it back in again. See how I'm catching it as soon as it comes back out. So the action of the pumping hand is almost a quick, snappy opening followed by a long drawing back in. A quick open and a long drawing back in, depending on the speed you need to maintain the volume that you're looking for, as we'll talk about shortly. If you have a little trouble getting that kind of motion with your hand, this is really what you need to be able to do. Try moving your hand and then, like you're throwing a ball, and then drawing it back in slowly. You can see that it's easy to flick your fingers out and draw them back in with the arm movement. And that can help you then learn how to do it without moving the arm. What I just demonstrated is some of the dynamic range of the harmonium. It can go from very soft to quite loud and back to soft again. And that really depends on how much air pressure there is in the instrument. The more pressure, the more air is forced past the reeds, causing them to vibrate more, which makes a louder sound. You could see in that demonstration that the faster I pump, the more I push air through the harmonium, the more I build up the pressure inside the instrument to make it louder. And then as I let go of the pumping and make it slower, you could tell that the volume diminishes. So you can, in fact, keep a fairly low volume on the instrument, something even to this level with just slow, gentle pumping. And you can see my action of the hand is I'm pulling it in very gently and I'm letting it out very quickly. And that keeps this very mellow tone going for an indefinite period of time. And that's one of the neat things about the harmonium and why they were so popular with all kinds of musicians, especially in Europe and America in the 1800s, was that before the advent of electronic instruments, this was really the only way to maintain a continuous sound. All other instruments like a piano, a guitar, a flute, they all have a big burst of sound and then it decays. But a harmonium, you can maintain the sound indefinitely with the proper pumping. And that made it very attractive to people wanting to sing devotional songs and hymns. Maintaining a steady volume means keeping that air pressure inside the instrument. If you pause too long when you're between the breaths, which is, say you hold the bellows in too long and don't let them back out, or wait too long to pull them back in once they are out, you can end up having a rather warbly or choppy effect of it. Let me try to demonstrate that. So if I just pump in once, and then I wait and I open and I pump in again, you can hear that kind of pulsing that's going on, and that can be a little bit unpleasant for people. The same thing also happens if you pull the thing in and then wait too long. The speed at which you have to pump really does depend on the particular instrument. This harmonium of mine is very well tuned, has a very good air capacity, so it's much more forgiving in the pumping than a harmonium that, say, has some leaks on the inside or somehow isn't as airtight as this one is. in which case it's bleeding air out without actually playing the notes. That can be a little more complicated to work with, in which case I recommend trying to get that instrument repaired. Exactly how much you need to pump the bellows really depends on, again, the instrument itself, the volume that you're trying to maintain. And the best way to do it is really to both listen to the volume and try to coordinate your hand with what you're hearing, but also to feel the stiffness of the bellows themselves. The more air pressure there is in the instrument, the harder it will be to push more air into it. So you'll feel the bellows that with your pumping hand start to stiffen up. And when the volume is decreasing and the air is bleeding out, you'll feel the bellows get less stiff. In that case, you can develop a kind of muscle memory within your pumping hand to really understand at what level you need to maintain it. Once you have the core pumping motion working, you can vary the volume of the harmonium by pumping faster, which increases the air pressure and thus the volume, or slower, which reduces air pressure and thus volume. I'm going to start softly and pump faster and harder, building up the volume, and then taper off on the pumping to let the volume come down. And as soon as it reaches a volume that I want to hold it at, I can find the right rhythm of the pumping to make sure I hold it at that, and I can even let it go down further and maintain that volume at even a very low level. So it all just depends on what level of sound you're looking for and finding that right relation with your pumping speed to get the volume that you'd like. Now the rate at which air pressure drops is going to depend on how many keys you have down. If you have just one key down, you can see that it goes for quite a while with just one pump of the bellows. If I have multiple keys down, it lasts much shorter. So if I'm going to say hold, a bunch of keys down, I have to pump a little harder to get a big volume. But if I have just one, I don't need anywhere near that kind of pumping action to maintain the same volume. The other piece to understand here too is that the more notes you have down, the more keys you have depressed, the more air will be flowing. There's going to be more holes open to more reeds, and so there's a greater airflow. That means to maintain a steady volume with one note requires a certain amount of pumping. To do it with, say, 4 notes requires a bit more to keep that same sound, because I have, instead of 2 air holes open to the reeds, I have now 8. So depending on how much you have to what kind of volume you're looking for, you may have to pump more or less depending on how many keys you have down. It's not that complicated, but again, it's a matter of learning how to feel the stiffness in the bellows and get that sense of muscle memory in your pumping hand to find what matches the volumes that you're looking for. Although the harmonium shares the same keyboard layout as a piano, it is a fundamentally different instrument. The piano is a percussion instrument. You have to strike the key with some force to move a hammer to strike the string to produce the sound. A harmonium is a wind instrument. It relies on the flow of air, which you're doing through the bellows. And when you depress a key, you open air holes to allow the air to flow past the reeds, causing them to vibrate. Which means you don't need any more force than is necessary to just depress that key to open the air holes. In fact, if you watch me here, I can depress very, very little and get a sound out of it. And I get more sound when I depress further because I open up the second hole, which opens up, sounds a second reed. But I don't have to strike the key at all. Basically, I can just depress them lightly. And I don't have to be hitting it with my hand in that way. You could see with that little passage that I didn't need to strike the keys very hard. On a harmonium, in fact, you don't want to strike the keys like you do on a piano because it would create a lot of extraneous noise like this. That's a little too heavy on the hand. You can just let your fingers float. So really just let the fingers float on the keyboard, wiggle them enough to depress the keys, and that's really all it takes. What's also helpful, though, from the learning a piano is that sometimes you're, say, holding a note here and you need to reach over while holding your thumb and reach over to another key that's lower so that the rest of your fingers stay higher on the keyboard. That is a fairly common motion with piano fingering that does work well on the harmonium as well. All that said, the harmonium does have one caveat as far as playing style is concerned, is that as soon as you let up on a key, the sound stops. This is very much like when you stop breathing in a wind instrument, the sound will just stop. So unlike a piano, which has, again, the same kind of keyboard that has a sustained sound, especially if you hold the damper pedal down, the strings will continue to vibrate for a while. The harmonium sound just stops as soon as you lift up on those keys. The consequence of having the sound stop as soon as you let up a note when you play the melody on a harmonium is that you do get a more pronounced staccato effect if you're playing more like a piano. So that's a little choppy, especially for devotional chanting, and so harmonium players learn to make their actions much more smooth. Here is where piano fingering can become an obstacle. So in melodies where you may need to be playing some notes lower on the keyboard and then some notes higher, especially between different phases of a chant, you may need to shift which finger is holding down a key. So if you're somewhere here, for example, you may need to shift your thumb up, hold the key down so that you can get a finger to a higher note, and then coming back down, you may need to, again, shift a finger like that. You never ever do this on a piano, but it's quite common on the harmonium because you really have to keep that continuous sound going. For example, watch what my fingers have to do to play Swami Kriyananda's chorded arrangement of Yogananda's chant, Door of My Heart. Learning to finger the harmonium in this way does take a lot of patience and practice, but what I just played for you is probably the most demanding, most complicated kind of fingering that you'll encounter. For most chants and even most playing styles, it's much simpler that you don't have to quite do as much holding keys down while you're moving from one key to the next and so forth. You'll find a more natural rhythm with those. Now that you have the basics of playing the harmonium literally in hand, we can look at some of the different playing styles. Those are single note melody, using a drone, playing chords, using a melody with chord-appropriate drones, and then what I call playing the melody with rhythm accidentals. We'll look at all 5 of these styles. Which style you depend is really a matter of personal preference, but also depends on the setting that you're using the harmonium in. If you're doing a lot of loud, boisterous music, you may be playing a lot more chords. If you're trying to lead a chant into a silent meditation, you may be using single note melody or some of the other quieter styles. It really depends, again, on the context and the purpose for which you're playing that chant. Some of the styles that I'll be demonstrating are more complex than the others, so give yourself time to learn and practice with the simpler ones before trying to move on to the more complex ones. That said, with all the styles together, your voice, especially with devotional chanting, is the most important instrument. Think of the voice as primary and the harmonium or guitar or any other instrument as a mere accompaniment. You're leading with the voice, especially when you're trying to, say, find the rhythm and tempo of a chant or a song. It's really good to just sing it a cappella, that is, without any accompaniment, and then match the accompaniment to what's natural to sing with the voice. Otherwise, you can get into situations where the instrument takes over somewhat and the demands of, say, strumming a guitar makes the song much slower than you would normally sing it without that accompaniment. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. The single note playing style is probably the clearest as where the aspirations of the melody are concerned. Because it focuses solely on the melody, the aspirations contained in the chant or the song are much more clearly expressed without the complications of chords or other kinds of harmonies mixing in with that. It's also fairly simple to play because you don't need to worry about what more than one finger is doing at any given time. Although with this chant you may have noticed that sometimes I needed to hold down a key and switch what finger I was playing because I moved up and down the keyboard somewhat. The melody of a song, and especially the melody of a devotional chant, is the most important part of the music because that's what carries the aspirations of the chant or of the song. If you learn no other style, then learn to play in this style because it is the most important. It's the foundation for devotional chanting especially. If you listen to some of the recordings, say of Swami Kriyananda on his album Music for Meditation or Kriyananda Chants Yogananda, you'll hear this style most of the time, and sometimes he also employs the rhythm accidentals, as I'll show later, but he really concentrates on just that melody so that there's no complications with chords and other harmonies being mixed in. If you can read music, then you can easily look at the notation in the Ananda chant book to find the notes. But if you can't read music easily, that's not really a problem because the chant book has the letters of the notes indicated here just above the lyrics, with the down arrow indicating a G below middle C, the C here, that's middle C, and sometimes there will be a note with an upper arrow to indicate something higher on the keyboard. So you can just put labels like little pieces of post-it notes on the different keys and learn how to play the melody using these note names down here. Don't worry so much about reading the rhythm because chants are usually so short you can hear recordings of them to find the rhythm and then you can just learn to play the notes according to that rhythm. One refinement with the single note melody style is that when you have successive notes that are the same and you're singing, say, multiple syllables on that same note, you don't need to tap the key more than once. You can just hold it down through that succession. If you move it up and down, you'll hear a bit more of a staccato effect, which may not be what you want with a chant. Let me demonstrate here with a line of Door of My Heart. Here it is when I play the successive notes repeatedly on the keyboard. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Versus door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Let me play that now without singing. Versus you can hear the difference that the second one is smoother than the first. And because you're usually singing a chant at this point, you can let the words and the lyrics and the changes in your voice give the rhythm to the chant rather than having to do it with the harmonium itself. The next style that I just demonstrated is playing a melody, primarily with one note of melody at a time, while holding down another key, which we call a drone being a continuous sound that is held throughout the duration of the chant. Now, depending on the chant, you may need to change the drone with different phrases and whatnot. And as I'll explain a little bit more, sometimes you need to change the drone because you might introduce a little bit of a disharmony within the melody itself. And you may have heard that in my little demonstration here. Many players prefer to use a drone during a chant because it's only incrementally more difficult than playing a single note melody, and it provides a richer, fuller sound and fills in some of the gaps if your fingering of the melody itself isn't as smooth. So with Door of My Heart, for example, it sounds more like this. smooth out any rough points if you're having a little trouble playing the melody very cleanly. The Ananda chant book also indicates appropriate drone notes for each chant, surrounded by these rectangles. Most chants, in fact, have one drone note for the entire chant. This particular example changes the drone after the repeat of a phrase. And so you're playing the entire phrase twice through with just that drone, and then you switch the drone, which isn't terribly complicated. Now, there is one caveat with playing with a drone, and that is because you're playing a note simultaneously with other notes in the melody, you're actually creating harmonies, you're creating chords. And sometimes those chords don't really come out as nicely or as harmoniously or as pleasant as you may want. So that chant that I played at the opening, Thousands of Suns, it starts here with what's a D major chord. There's a little bit of a discord there, but it passes, so listen again. But then in the second phrase, we get to a place where we're holding that drone with a disharmonious note for a little bit longer. So listen to this part. You hear the discordant there? That's what can actually be created when you're sticking to one drone for, say, the whole chant, or are unable to switch the drone. So we need to learn how, if you want to improve that style, to learn how to switch the drone a little bit more. But to understand that, we need to understand a little bit about chords. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. I will never forget thee, I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee, I will never forsake thee. Playing with chords can be a rewarding way, especially for beginners, because as you might have noticed with my playing hand, I only needed to switch one note, and I only needed to make that switch once every phrase. It becomes a very, very low level of demand on your playing hand, and gives you good practice to learn how to pump and learn how to sustain the sound. I had a friend who I taught to play the harmonium, and he was an electrician, and his hands weren't particularly dexterous on musical instruments. And I showed him how to play this chant with just that one note switch, just changing those two fingers in the middle. And that became his chant for a long time when he led meditations and did chanting. That's the chant he played because it was one that he could actually master. In this chant too, the chord change can be easily made again by only changing the middle finger and the index finger back and forth like this, while the thumb and the pinky finger remain on the same keys the whole time. And for this reason, Listen, Listen, Listen becomes the simplest starter chant for new players to learn. The other thing that playing with chords does really well is if you're playing with other instruments, such as a guitar, that are often chorded instruments unless you have a really skilled guitarist who can play a melody on the strings, then it's easier to match the chords on the harmonium with the chords on the guitar and not have as many complications that you might playing in another style. So again, it's sometimes a good entry-level method of chanting. That said, there is a drawback to it, which is the melody in a song, especially a devotional chant, expresses the aspirations of the song, the aspirations of the heart toward higher consciousness. Whereas harmonies, which is the relationship between simultaneous notes, deepens the feelings in the heart, but keeps it more on the heart level. When you're playing, especially for meditation, you're trying to lift the energy in the spine from the heart up to the spiritual eye. So using chords too much ends up keeping the energy in the heart rather than allowing it to rise. Now, that said, there is a place for it even in chanting before a meditation, which is you can start a chant with more heavy chording and then gradually thin those notes out to get to the point where you're playing just a single note melody with perhaps the rhythm accidentals, as I'll show later. That can be a very effective way in the context of a single chant to start with a lot of energy and start building up that fullness of the heart, but then let it release to go more inward and upward to the spiritual eye as befits meditation. The Ananda chant book indicates chords for many chants. You can see a chord appear, a D, a G, and a D, an A, and a D. And you can see that the chords don't change as frequently as the melody notes. Sometimes there's a quick chord change, sometimes there's chords on every measure, sometimes on half measures. It all depends on how you want to play it. But they are generally less frequently changed than the melody, so it makes it a little easier to play. Unlike Listen, Listen, Listen that has only 2 chords, most chants have 3 and sometimes even more chords than that, and it can be fairly demanding on how you actually have to shift your fingers. I mentioned before the arrangement of Door of My Heart that Swami Kriyananda did that uses a lot of chords. Let me play that for you here up close, and you can see that there's a lot of changes going on and a lot of fingering that's demanded with the chord changes. To help smooth those transitions, there's something called chord inversions that become very, very handy for you to understand. Let me show you some of that. It's generally easier to switch between different inversions than to switch between what are called the root forms of a chord, which is this for C, C, and then the 3rd and the 5th. This is the first inversion that starts on the 3rd, and the second inversion that starts on the 5th. This is a root C chord, this is a root F chord, and this is a root G chord. These 3 chords are used together quite frequently. You can see that switching between those requires a lot of hand movement on the keyboard, but I could go between the root form of the C chord, the second inversion of the F, which actually shares the C note here, and then switch from that to the first inversion of the G, something like this. You can see that because those inversions are all very closely aligned on the keyboard, I don't have to move my hands quite nearly as much. When I played that chant earlier, Thousands of Suns, we heard that there were some places like this where we had a rather discordant combination between the drone note here that we were using and the melody note that was held for some time. The way I just played it, I shifted the drone note from the A, sometimes down to the G and sometimes to the D up here to better match the melody and to keep it more in harmonious chords. Let's come in and take a closer look at that. So specifically, you sometimes use a note and a chord for that segment of the chant, meaning that you might be changing drones as often as you change chords, sometimes once per measure or even more. And it also sometimes means that you just abandon the drone for a note or two until it's suitable to bring it back in. Clearly, this is a more complicated playing style than just using 1 or maybe 2 drones throughout the course of a chant, but the reward is that you get more harmony with chorded instruments like a guitar, and it also allows you to thin the richness out, to thin the fullness of the sound during the course of a single chant, especially if you want to bring it more and more inward toward a meditation, for example, where you don't want as much of that energy in the heart, but you want to allow it to lift up to the spiritual eye. Learning this style does take some more practice, but it does lead very well to the final chanting style, which we'll do next. If you listen to some of Kriyananda's albums like Music for Meditation and Kriyananda Chants Yogananda, you'll hear that in addition to playing primarily the single note melody, he also throws in little other sounds occasionally, little taps on the keyboard, little extra sounds that are not really adding drones, not really adding chords, but adding something of a deeper richness to the chant, just as I was demonstrating. This is a playing style I call a single note melody with rhythm accidentals. Now, the accidentals that you play, the other notes that you're playing to make that little rhythmic effect, are usually notes that would be in the appropriate chord at that time, which is why learning to play chords is actually helpful in this regard. The result of this is a richness of accompaniment that gives you a lot of what chords and drones offer without some of the complications of chords and drones, and gives you a way to really, again, thin out the fullness of the sound if you're trying to lead a chant into meditation. I think it is one of the most rewarding styles to play. It is the hardest, I think, too, to master, but it's something great to aspire toward. To wrap up this video then, I want to play for you my rendition of Yogananda's chant, I Will Sing Thy Name, and I'm going to start it with a lot more richness, a lot more fullness, using heavier chords, and a lot more emphasis on harmony. And as I sing it along, I'm going to begin to thin out that sound, and I'm going to then go more toward a single note melody. And as I'm singing as well, I'm going to use what Yogananda called his 5 states chanting method, which is to chant loudly at first, then more softly, then in a whisper, and then to chant silently in the subconsciousness, focusing at the medulla oblongata at the base of the brain, and then to increase the volume still without singing, but to focus on superconscious silent chanting, as he called it, where the focus is at the spiritual eye. And in this way, through the course of a chant, I can get that richness of the heart, but I can then start to thin it out, bring that energy in, and focus it up very, very distinctly toward the spiritual eye, as Yogananda recommended. And with that, I wish you all the best in learning to play this wonderful instrument and bringing it into your spiritual life. Joy to you.